Emily Wilder is an island-born entrepreneur and oyster fanatic with over a decade of supporting sustainable food-oriented businesses, most recently with her Langley-based business Salinity Seafood More. Emily earned her BA in Sustainable Food and Agriculture at Evergreen while running the educational oyster farm along the edge of Evergreen's 1,000-acre forest. After Evergreen, Emily earned her master's in business and marketing at Bentley University. After working for some of the top shellfish farms in the country, Emily returned to Whidbey Island to start the Salinity Seafood More store. Emily offers marketing, website administrative, sustainable business coaching for small businesses with one-on-one sessions and a free weekly public work session outside of her Salinity shop. This year she launched the Whidbey Oyster Network, a peer-to-peer info sharing and guest speaker series dedicated to sharing shellfish knowledge and increasing the oyster population on Whidbey by incentivizing waterfront property owners to start their own shellfish gardens. I'm sure we'll be hearing a little bit more about all of those things in her presentation, so now I'd like to welcome Emily.
All right, I'm going to use the headset so I can hold shells. As you can see, there are shells here, some there, some here. After the show, you are welcome to come up and take a look at these. I'll stick around for a little while. We can do a little more questions. So as she said, I started at the Evergreen State College. My favorite part of that was organizing fancy dress costume days at our oyster farm. Master's in business because I realized early on that I wanted to teach people about oysters, and only people who were already interested in oysters wanted to hear about oysters. So I went into business and marketing to figure out what other channels can I come up with to draw people into this conversation about sustainability and water quality. I worked at Island Creek Oysters when I was still over on the East Coast, and then came back to Taylor Shellfish here, our big Washington State company, and then moved back to the island to work with, through my business, work with the two closest commercial oyster farms to us. So neither of them are on Whidbey Island, but Skagit Shellfish is based in Mount Vernon. Their facility is there, but their farms are in Skagit Bay by the north end of Camano Island. And then the Swinomish Shellfish Company is farming in Similk Bay, much closer to us, and their facility is on the reservation there. And they also just opened a raw bar in La Conner that you can go to during the summer. We're very lucky in Puget Sound because we have this massive estuary, and oysters require brackish water, which is a combination of salt water and fresh water. So they won't survive out on the coast where it's totally pure salt water, and they won't survive in, a lake with totally fresh water. So we have all of these nooks and crannies for them to grow. My business started as an online store in 2021. I wanted to talk to people about our native species of oyster, this little guy, the Olympia oyster. And I thought maybe if I add some smoked salmon, people will be more interested, maybe a little bit of seaweed. And now the store has a couple hundred items from 85 small businesses in the Northwest. So we've got the things you see here and a wide variety of snacks, jerkies, condiments, just really high quality, sustainable items from cool people in the Pacific Northwest. There's about 5% of the items are not made in the Northwest, but they are either just spectacular or very helpful for us, like things that will help get rid of headaches. And so these are the two farms that I work with in relation to us there. We are in a strange kind of period with the actual shipping and delivery of the oysters as far as my business. So it's a little awkward right now because this particular month I do not have fresh oysters available. The farms are taking a short break so that the oysters can grow a little bit better in the spring because their shells are a lot more fragile. And we're also reconfiguring how we're going to actually get the oysters to people, because the permits that I hold currently to sell oysters directly to people, the state actually tripled the price of them for the permit this year, and then it's set to double next year as well. So it's because we desperately need more money into these programs to monitor the shellfish. So it's understandable why they need more money, but it means that I will probably be redirecting you to order through Whidbey Island Grown Food Hub, which serves the whole island and amazing variety of food. So you'll be able to order oysters through them next month is the plan. But I will still be providing education and shelf-stable oysters and workshops where you can taste them. My store is down on the south end of the island in Bayview, in the old Bayview Corner facility. So I share it with the Island Shakespeare Festival, because I've been doing a pop-up at their big summer festival every year. So this year it'll be Macbeth and Robin Hood at the Island Shakespeare Festival, and it's the middle of July through the first week in September. Sliding scale tickets, so you can come every night, pay no money, just give us all of your energy. We want a full house every single night. But we bring professional actors from all around the country. So 1,000 people auditioned this year, and we've got 11 of the best arriving next week. You can see on my website the different workshops that I offer, and I do, down on the south end, I do this oysters and beer event every quarter at Thirsty Crab Brewery. So we do a pairing with the oysters, as well as this, pretty much this lecture that you're going to receive again. So if you want that hammered in with some beer, that's perfect. And then the free marketing clinic that I do weekly, Andre back here and recording this session is also attending there, and we're just there to help answer your technical questions, give you marketing advice, because I found that so many of these sustainable producers and farmers and business owners, they're a lot more focused on doing the work than about getting that message out there. And it's really cool if you're growing oysters, but if you don't have a website in order to tell people that you're growing oysters, or you don't have, receipt tracking or, an expense spreadsheet to sell them to a distributor, then you're going to be not able to support your business long term. So sustainable for me really is a big picture thing. And that is part of what led to the Whidbey Oyster Network. So we started in January. And it's, so many people here are already growing oysters on the island, on their little waterfront properties. Is anyone here growing oysters? Yes, awesome.
Our waterfront property, it's friends.
Yes, and that is a great way to do it. And that is what I wanted with this oyster network too, is so, connecting people who have waterfront property or who have energy, or money to purchase the oyster seed, and connecting those people with resources and with each other. So it can be this collaborative effort, because the oysters are dependent on good water quality. And it's sometimes it's just as simple as getting your septic system checked, picking up your pet waste, checking in with the businesses that are along the waterfront, seeing, what kind of waste management they have going on. All of these things impact the oysters, which we can eat, and then impact all sorts of other animals and plants that we don't get as much direct incentive from, but are crucial for our ecosystems. So this is how they do it. They purchase oyster seed, little baby oysters from Taylor Shellfish, and you just need your parcel ID number. So if you know someone with waterfront property, check out the Whidbey Oyster Network, and even go on yourself to the Taylor Shellfish website for their seed sales and get info about that. And if you are wanting to to harvest your own oysters or your own clams or anything on our beaches here, especially during the summer, people start to really think about that. And you want to be really careful and check the Washington shellfish map from the Department of Health before you go. So you can just Google WA shellfish map and pull this up, and it changes every day. And each of these little areas, if you click on them, it'll expand and it'll tell you this beach is closed for all species, or this beach is closed for varnish clams and butter clams. That's a really common one. So even when a beach is closed for varnish clams or butter clams, it can still be safe for other clams. So they will be really specific in those notes. And if you have a farm or like a little oyster garden in like this area, then you can click on the areas around it to see if there are any warnings near there, if there's no direct information exactly where you're looking for. So we want to really err on the side of caution at all times. And the most important part with any harvesting of shellfish, water quality and temperature. They're highly perishable items, so you want to get them, to fridge temperature as quickly as possible. Below 45 degrees in an hour is my recommendation to everyone. We go a little stricter when it comes to, recreational harvesting, because we want to make sure that you are not getting anyone accidentally sick at a potluck, and individuals don't have access to the same level of testing and monitoring as the large farms do. They have binders and so many different checklists that they have to go through and permitting processes to make sure that their product is really safe. But when you do those things, then you can actually be reassured that the shellfish are as safe as the lettuce that you can get at the store. So when we do the Whidbey Oyster Network, if we're doing tastings and people are harvesting their own, I have them go through this checklist of different things to pay attention to. So I kept them in the water, not just, in a bucket of water in my house. I checked the water quality on the safety map. No excessive rainfall 3 days prior to harvest, because rainfall can wash all of these extra contaminants from the areas around the water. Sorry, that's not, let me start over with that. If there's extra rainfall, they're failing how to describe what's wrong. Yeah, runoff, that is the word. So there's excessive runoff, and it can also mess with the ratio of the actual salinity in the water, which is the salt level. So you can end up with water that is too fresh, and just generally you want to wait after they've been, more than an inch. It really does vary bay to bay, but I would say an inch is a good thing to base it off of for the individual little recreational harvesting. We want to harvest as the tide is going out, so you're minimizing exposure to warm air and sun. You don't want oysters that are just baking out in the sun. If the water temperature itself is over 65 degrees, then we don't harvest. We're just gonna, wait. They're actually at their best in the winter, so people often think shellfish in the summer, and they are a fun thing to eat during the summer. And if you are following these rules or buying from a farm that's following these rules, then totally fine. But there's a lot more risk in the summer. So the cooling below 45 within 1 hour is a little bit strict, but it is my preference. You can just use ice packs and a cooler, or totally cover them with ice. You want to keep them at fridge temp around 35 to 40 degrees. They can freeze if you have them go below, freezing, obviously. So we want them to actually stay alive, which is what's required for that. And then don't store them for very long. Check the temperature. You can just store them in an open container in your fridge, and they will last for actually up to a week or sometimes longer. You just want to make sure that they are fully closed. So there should be liquid inside of the shell still. But as long as there's liquid inside of the shell and it doesn't smell bad, they can stay for quite a while in your fridge. They might not taste quite as good. You might want to cook them instead of just eating them raw. But one of the advantages to growing your own oysters is you can eat them the day that you harvested them. Okay, so I'm gonna move a little faster. Okay, so I usually do this lecture in about 2 hours. So I'm gonna try to not talk too fast, but also get you a lot of information. And you can also follow up with me through the website. There's a chat button at any time. So there's a Facebook group for the Whidbey Oyster Network, and our next meeting is next Thursday. And we have different speakers from the oyster industry and shellfish. So our first speaker was from Puget Sound Restoration Fund, and they're doing amazing work restoring our native oyster species, which is this little one here. And they've restored about 150 acres so far this since like 2000, I believe. And it's really important because that native species is at about like 5% of its historic level. So it was pretty much wiped out during the gold rush. And then there was actually, so it was like the gold rush, and then the pulp mill started in South Sound. So we were eating as many as we could, and then pollution was impacting the little ones growing. And this oyster here is about 5 years old compared to this 6-month-old other one. So what we switched to about 100 years ago was a species from Japan, and that can be this size. It can grow to this size. And pretty much all the oysters you're gonna get at an oyster bar, if they're from the West Coast, are going to be the Japanese species. There's another one called the Kumamoto that's also from Japan, from southern Japan. And I will be getting more into these things as we go. This is the book that started it all for me. It is back there if you want to take a look at it. And this is our native oyster with its beautiful colors inside of the shell. So when we're talking about shellfish, the word shellfish does encompass both mollusks and crustaceans, but crab are more closely related to spiders than they are to oysters. And oysters are cousins of slugs and squid and octopi. But more closely related, we have the yeah, smoked oyster dip. I like that. I'm curious at the end of this what everyone's favorite shellfish recipes are. So remind me about that. So mussels, clams, scallops, and oysters are all kind of in that close little group of bivalves. And this is more science than you probably want today. We are going to be talking about the geoduck clam a little bit. I don't know if you saw the bumper stickers that we have for those. We have shirts as well with the geoducks. And these clams, just so you know, this is a clam species that's also from Japan, but is the predominant West Coast clam. So if you get steamed clams at a restaurant, they're going to be this Manila clam species from Japan, but they look very similar to our native little neck species that you would find when you're out harvesting them. They just last a little bit longer out of the ground. So I always like to start with scallops because of all the mollusks, they are the most mobile and the most mildly terrifying. So these are eyes. These little blue things are eyes, and it's not the best eyesight, but it's enough that they think that they can get around because they can also open and close their shell to move themselves around. So, clams are buried in the ground. Oysters glue themselves to something when they're babies, and then that's it. But scallops can move around, but they are still, they just have a really rudimentary nervous system. They actually don't have a brain. So they can't tell that they're in captive, cages. So this is called a lantern net, and this is the best way that you can contain them, because I know an oyster farm that started raising scallops, and they originally had them in these hard mesh containers that they keep their oysters in. And the scallops would just bash themselves into the side of the cage because they never got the message. There was no message going to anywhere in their body that they should stop. So they ended up just dying. And so this allows them to be contained. There's not a whole lot of scallop farming on this coast, but there's a lot more scallop ranching where they will find some wild scallops and then allow them to grow larger in a contained area. Mussels are attached to a long tube, basically like a sock, when they're small, and then they get hung down from rafts. You can also do these on your own private farms. If you do shellfish gardening, you can get mussel seed, clam seed, geoduck seed, and 3 different species of oyster seed from Taylor shellfish. These are manila clams. This is a mix of manila clams and our native species of littleneck, and they look very similar. Like I said, there's a little difference in the shape of their shell. Our littlenecks are a little bit more rounded, but you can just dig them up basically like potatoes. There's actually a farmer up in Samish Bay called Bill Dewey, named Bill Dewey, and he got a tulip bulb harvester from the Netherlands and converted it so that he could put it out on his clam beds and have it do the harvesting, because it's a lot of manual labor. So the shellfish industry in general, there's so much manual labor, there's not a lot that you can automate with it, and it's pretty backbreaking work. So the reason that shellfish is so expensive, it has a very short shelf life, it takes a lot of work, and there's a really high mortality rate. So you recognize that about 50 to 70% of the seed that you grow is probably going to die. And so you just have to build that into your numbers in the beginning. Geoduck and baby geoducks are one of my favorite things. This is my hand, and it's from a photo shoot that's also on the Wikipedia page here. So the Evergreen State College, their mascot is the geoduck, and they're just giant clams that are native to the Pacific Northwest, actually to the whole West Coast. And this is a little geoduck shell, but they can get obviously quite large, and this siphon extends, this one extended 5 feet, so they burrowed down into the ground. What you will find often on our beaches is this, which is actually a horse clam or a gaper clam. And there's a very subtle difference in the way the rings are formed. The geoduck clam is a little bit more of a rounded rectangle rather than a circular thing. But you can eat both of them raw or cooked, and they are quite delicious. But there's a shorter siphon on a horse clam, so they don't bury themselves as deep into the ground. And when you purchase the seed, you would get these little ones, and you would put 3 of them into one of these little mesh tubes. And that will keep some of the predators out, because if you're a duck, that is delicious. You want to eat those. So that'll keep you at least a little bit further away from them. But then you're expecting that you'll get 1 or 2 of those 3 to survive. This is a geoduck with the shell removed. This part you want to cook fully, but the rest you can eat raw, and I love them in all different shapes. They're delicious. Okay, that's it for the other shellfish. Now we're just going to talk about oysters. So oyster growing methods, there are a million variations and more every day. But what used to be, the standard was just a whole bunch of oysters out on the beach. And they will grow, they will eat microalgae from the water. You don't have to feed them once they're out on the beach. And you're gonna get an oyster that, has some of these nice frilly edges, but also maybe it's stuck to a rock. Maybe it's long and skinny. So in around the 90s, we really started moving into what we call the half shell market. So, oyster bars serving a single beautiful oyster on a plate. So we became a lot more interested in the appearance of the shell instead of just, how many oysters can I shuck to fill a jar for, making chowder. So a lot of the farms started doing suspended bag growing. So you have a mesh bag with oysters in it, and then you have a buoy attached to it. And as the tide goes up and goes in and out, the water moves it around, and those oysters are going to run into each other. They're gonna tumble around, so we call them tumbled oysters. And they're gonna break off the outer edges of each other's shells. So it's a very similar process to a bonsai tree, where you are deciding where you want it to grow. You're keeping it from growing, crazy wild shapes. You are getting this beautifully manicured oyster. So this is one that had a little bit of shaping in the beginning, and then it was allowed to grow on the beach without being pruned regularly. This is one that was grown in a bag that was on the ground, so it didn't get as much wave action, but humans came along and shook the bag every once in a while, so the oysters would get a little bit of pruning, but not a ton. So you can see there's some ridge formation, but a lot of it is smoothed off. And you'll be able to come up and look at these more closely after. The Kumamoto species has a lot more pronounced ridges. And for the most part, people are only doing the Kumamotos and our native Olympia species directly on the ground. There is some suspended bag, but you don't usually add a lot of tumbling action to them because they're a little bit smaller, a little more fragile. But so this little rounded one, totally smooth. It's gonna grow to be a nice little gondola-shaped oyster. So they are alive when you eat them, and that is part of the reputation that oysters have for being aphrodisiacs, is that vitality that they give you. They also are really high in zinc and omega-3s and iodine and iron and all sorts of different nutrients that give us energy. But a lot of it is, there are very few foods that we eat as they are eating us. So one of my mentors likes to say, as you are tasting the oyster, it is tasting you. I usually tell people that far before they're actually having to eat the oyster itself. But they die like a minute or two after you cut the mussel and shuck the oyster. So if you're really bothered by it, you can, let it sit for a little while, but make sure that it's sitting, at a good temperature. A lot of the time during the summer, people will shuck an oyster and then it's sitting out in the hot sun. And even if it's on a bed of ice, that temperature from the top could rise the temperature into what we call the danger zone. So the danger zone is 40 degrees to 140 degrees, and that's where bacteria grows exponentially. So we don't want food in that. We want to raise it up over it or keep it below it. So as long as the water that the oysters are in is relatively clean, you can be reassured that the oyster itself is going to be fairly good for you. Like I said, they contain a lot of really great nutrients. You don't necessarily need to read all of this. It's more to illustrate to you that these microalgae that they're eating, when we're producing it in a hatchery for the baby oysters, there is such a high quantity that they need to eat, and they're eating a combination of so many different species that 2/3 of a hatchery's production space is devoted to the food for the oysters. So you'll have giant swimming pools with oysters that look like tiny little air bubbles, and they'll need massive quantities of food. And as they get bigger throughout their lives, just the first couple weeks in the hatchery, they need different size foods. So there are thousands of different species of microalgae just in Puget Sound that they're able to eat. And it is, there's basically microscopic little seaweed, sea vegetables. It's really nutritious, and it's a lot of the omega-3 content in an oyster. And it's also why oysters taste really different from one bay to another, or even one oyster growing next to another. They have a very different combination of microalgae in their stomachs. A single oyster, about this big, can filter 50 gallons of water every single day. And these days, what you're getting at an oyster bar is more like this size usually. That can still be 30 gallons every single day. So the great thing about that is they are only eating the microalgae from the water, but they are taking every other particle out of the water and they're removing it from their water column. They cover it in basically spit, and then when it goes out of their shell, it goes down to the ground where there's a lot of bacteria and worms that want to break down those dirt particles wrapped in oyster spit. So by taking them out of the water column, they allow a lot more sunlight to get through the water. So if you think of like tropical water, crystal clear, you can look through it, no microalgae. Our water here, the reason we can't see through it is in large part because we have actually an overabundance of microalgae in Puget Sound. We have so many farms with their excess nitrogen coming into our waters, and just overall in Puget Sound, we are rich in microalgae, and we could stand to have way more oysters and other filter feeders as well. So we do have a lot of geoduck in Puget Sound. So clams, mussels, scallops, those are all filter feeders as well. And we actually have more geoduck by pound than any other species in Puget Sound. So more than orcas, pounds of orcas. We have geoducks all under the water. So if you're taking the ferry or the bridge, you know, there are geoducks deep in the ground underneath you under the water. So this filtration system is really important because you can actually have shellfish in the water to clean the water up. So if you have a contaminated area of water like the New York Harbor, and you know, the New York Harbor used to be so full of oysters that they could not get their oyster boat, they couldn't get their human boats, large boats into the bay when the European settlers first arrived, because the oysters there grow attached to each other like this, and so they form these big reefs. And there were so many of them that fed the people who built the New York City, but then they were also dumping their waste right next to the oysters that they were eating. So a lot of why oysters have a bad reputation is from things like that, where people were really not paying attention to, they didn't know about food safety. They didn't know about temperature. They didn't know about water quality. So a lot of this fear of shellfish and oysters comes from very real things to be afraid of. But we know so much more now that we can prevent such a high percentage of the risk that used to be an issue. So the old myth about don't eat oysters in months that don't have R, don't eat oysters during the summer. That was really important when you didn't have water quality testing, but you knew that bacteria rises during the summer because of the heat. And you didn't have, refrigerated rail cars, but they were sending oysters on rail cars across the country and then serving them to people. A lot of the time when people get sick, it's not actually because of the oysters, which is not a nice thing to say to somebody when they got sick. But also there are a lot of really bad oysters out there. So I recommend, if you've had an oyster and you really didn't like it, whether it was raw or cooked, think about, maybe it was that place. Maybe they didn't know enough about shellfish themselves. They didn't have fresh oysters. They didn't have their cooking method down, so they overcooked it. Maybe that farm that they got them from was actually not such a good farm. Maybe it was a size that I didn't like. Maybe it was this big, and really what I want is this big. Or maybe what you really want is our native species that's this big, and it has meat the size of a quarter, but that flavor is so dynamic and large that you really don't need anything. It doesn't taste like a salty egg yolk. It tastes like the Pacific Northwest. It's a little bit sweet, it's a little like nutty, you get a little bit of the forest and the rain and everything in there. This is a time-lapse video. You can find a bunch of these online with a tank of water from a bay and that same water with oysters in it. And then an hour and 24 minutes later, you see the one with the oysters, and they have cleaned up that water. So the New York Harbor has a project called Billion Oyster Project, and they're trying to put 1 billion oysters into that water. So they're not eating those oysters, but those oysters are cleaning up the water. And then maybe someday you could eat those oysters. It's probably not likely from the New York Harbor, but you are able to clean it up. And so that species that they're using is the Virginica species, which is native to the entire East Coast. So the Gulf and all up there into Canada. Prince Edward Island oysters are really famous. So those are the same, Maine oysters are the same as Texas oysters. They'll just look and taste really, really different depending on where they're grown and how you grow them. But they are a lot more similar to this Japanese species that we grow here on the West Coast, and they're very different from our native little species. How am I doing on time? Probably not great. Oh, 20 minutes, cool. Okay, so when we wiped out our native species, is that my earring? Okay, so our native species, the entire West Coast and up into BC, they did still have some wild populations of this native species up in the British Columbia Islands, and that's what that book, The Living Shore, talks about by Rowan Jacobson. But it takes them so long to get back to this size, and they're a lot more finicky than the East Coast oyster or the Japanese oyster that we grow now. So they don't like it when it's too hot, they don't like it when it's too cold, they want to be covered by water as much as possible, so you want to put them further down on your beach than the other oysters. I think they're very much Pacific Northwesterners because I feel the same way. I don't want to be too hot, too cold, just 50 degrees and I'm happy. But you can eat them at any size, so even one this big. The Olympia oyster is a lot more similar to, I like to use a whiskey metaphor for the oysters. So a lot of oysters are like really nice blend, that like you're gonna put it into a cocktail, it's a nice, like it's a good flavor, but you're happy to, mix it with other flavors and make it more exciting. But an Olympia oyster is like an aged single malt scotch, where like this is a sipping whiskey. You want to have little sips, you want to savor it, you taste 20 different things, and then you just are like, wow, that was an experience. So that is why I became so obsessed with oysters in particular, and this little one, they're also so beautiful. As you could hear from the clanking against the microphone, I am wearing oyster shell earrings. So I do jewelry with them. I sometimes glue googly eyes onto them. And they are just such a wide variety of colors. There are some up here you can see that have like purplish and blue and metallic. I've had ones that are like a vibrant deep orange on the inside. Just gorgeous, gorgeous ones. The European flat oyster, their native one is also very similar to ours, and there's a Chilean native species as well that's very similar to our Olympia oyster species. So even though it's called the Olympia oyster, it does grow on the whole West Coast, but it was a big part of actually how Olympia became Washington state capital, because they were debating over different locations, and the Olympia party brought a whole bunch of oysters and said, here, eat these and make us the capital. And it worked. The unfortunate part of so much of our lives these days is we've had so many carbon emissions going into the atmosphere that we have seen changes in our climate, and 2/3 of those carbon emissions have actually been stored down in the ocean. So sequestered in the ocean is what they call it. And that carbon is actually acidic. And so it's slowly raising the acidity of the ocean. And for the most part, it has been just like stored, like it went just deep down into the ocean. So the deepest parts of the ocean where we haven't even gone yet, that's been slowly getting more acidic. And it takes, currents coming up from there for us to have an impact. And here on the West Coast, we've started feeling those impacts around like 2008, much faster than on the East Coast, because the East Coast, if you know, they're, on a large scale, their beaches kind of slope down into the Atlantic. But here, our beaches, and then there's a big drop off. So the West Coast, huge drop off where we have much closer access to that deep down ocean. So we were having upwellings from the deep ocean and really acidic water coming up and damaging the oyster shells when they're in the most fragile stages of their growth in the very beginning of their lives. So it took a while for the oyster hatcheries to figure out what was going on. But now what they do is they test the water, and it can vary, day by day depending on currents. And so they can add something pretty similar to baking soda to just raise the pH a little bit and level it out to what they need it to be as they need it. But in the long term, that's not going to work. We are expecting, at least until, I don't think actually that's not even an accurate. 10 years ago, I used to be able to say, if we stopped all emissions now, it wouldn't reverse itself until, 2050. And that is still, that was wishful thinking then. And at this point, we are just pretty much expecting there will be a point in the next few decades where the water will be too acidic for the oysters. So we want to do what we can to reverse things and to protect the ecosystems we have for as long as possible, and basically eat as many oysters as you can now. So this, that is really loud. Okay. The oyster life cycle is really best experienced when you're walking through a hatchery. So I used to do those tours, like 50 people a day walking through and seeing the baby oysters in all their different stages. So if you ever get the chance, you can go, actually my old employer's Island Creek Oysters, they do tours every summer of their hatchery. And I think Taylor Shellfish will sometimes do public tours, and there are a few others as well. So go and see it if you can. Baby oysters, adorable, and all of the different colors of microalgae and the giant tubes, amazing. So I'm gonna go through this with trying to make it clear what happens in the wild versus what happens in a commercial operation. So you have adult-sized oysters, we call them brood stock, and they are about this big. It's often like between these two sizes. And you have to get a whole bunch of them into a tank. You need large enough numbers because you can't actually tell which one is a male and a female in that moment from looking at them. You need to dissect them in order to tell. So usually they just are gathering, a whole bunch and hoping that the ratios are pretty good. But a single female oyster can release over 3 million eggs every time that they spawn. So you have a lot of chances there. And it's also very difficult because oysters change their gender throughout their lives. So you have no way to say, okay, this is my female brood stock pile, this is my male, next year I'll come back and just combine them like that. So it's called a sequential hermaphrodite, and that means that they are a hermaphrodite, so male and female, but sequential, so at different times they are each one. So they will often go back and forth throughout their lifetimes. They start out as no gender, and then they usually spend like the first year of their what would be the spawning time to, if the water is warm enough for them to spawn, they'll be a male. And then as they get older and stronger, often they'll transition to female to produce eggs, and then back to male. There's some indications that temperature or the populations around them influence that decision. If they think, we need to actually have more males here, we need more females. But for the most part, scientists are still trying to figure out how and why that exactly happens. So when you are, when it's out in the wild, this is just happening on a beach. If the water gets above 65 degrees, the oysters start putting energy into their gonad, which will either produce eggs or sperm. And that'll be right around here. And so sometimes, like if you shuck an oyster during the summer and there's some white stuff there, the eggs also look like sperm. You can tell, like if you hold the shucking knife like up to a light or with a magnifying glass, you can see like little white dots if it's egg, but it looks really similar and it tastes really similar. So once the water gets around 70, 75 degrees, that triggers them to open their shell and release the sperm or the egg. So the East Coast species and the Japanese species, they both release sperm and eggs. So it's totally what we call broadcast spawning. So sperm and eggs into the water, fertilization happens out in the water away from the parents. But our native species, the little Olympia species, and the European ones are actually brooders. So like a chicken, they keep the eggs inside of the shell and they hatch inside of the shell. So the Olympia oyster babies spend a couple weeks of their lives with their mother. They get the protection of the shell. So these shells are made of calcium carbonate, which is a pretty high pH, and it provides a little bit of localized protection from ocean acidification. So if you are a little baby oyster in this stage where you're just starting to grow your shell from calcium ions out in the water, and you are hoping that that acidic water is not going to damage your high pH little shell, then it's nice to have the protection of your mother's shell around you. There's also less predator risk with that. But either way, you're going to have a fertilized egg turn into a little oyster larva. And so the first couple weeks of their lives, they're swimming around. They have these little hairs basically that allow them to move around. And they have this little eye spot. And that is not an eye like we have or even like the scallops have. It just allows them to detect a little bit of light. So that little oyster swimming around, it's mostly being moved by the currents. It's not doing a ton of swimming, but it's trying to be up by the surface because it's eating all that microalgae. And microalgae uses photosynthesis to grow just like any other plant. So it needs to be up at the surface. So they're looking for the light and they're trying to be up where the light is. And they're trying to eat, get big. And they have this little foot that develops that they're gonna lose pretty quickly. But once they're ready, in a couple weeks, they fall down to the ground and they use that little foot to move around just a tiny bit. They're still very, very small, can't really see them very well. Basically like the size of a grain of sand at that point. And they'll use that little foot to move around, and then they glue themselves to whatever surface they can find. So this is a Pacific oyster, the Japanese species, growing on a farm. It was allowed to grow a little big, partly because it started getting our native species in the wild attaching to it. So these were wild native Olympia oysters that were swimming around as larvae. And when you're a larvae with no brain, you have no way of knowing where you should attach yourself for the rest of your life. So you have these sensors for things that also have a high pH. So you're going to be attracted to oyster shells, calcium carbonate, but also things with a similar chemical composition. So old-time oyster farmers used to take a stick, dip it in limestone, or other similar things, and stick that on the beach, and then you get a whole bunch of little baby oysters attached to it. And Okay, no turning. So if you don't have something for them to attach to, like other oyster shells, they'll attach to a rock. They'll attach to whatever they can, but if there's nothing for them to attach to, if it's totally soft mud, then you will get oysters suffocating and dying in the mud. So that's part of why we want as many shells to stay on the beach as possible. You know, there are enough shells going off of beaches into restaurants, so if you want to do crafts with oysters, that is awesome. You totally should. Help spread the word about oysters, and there are so many restaurants who are throwing them away. And so we can start diverting some of those shells away from the landfills and put them into art. There is a path towards cleaning them enough that they could be put back onto the beach from a restaurant. But we have to be really careful that we don't introduce contaminants, because you can have so many little, bacteria, invasive species hiding in these crevices. And, if you're eating the oyster on the beach, you can leave that shell right there. But if you took it off the beach and then said, oh, I'll just, bring it to my little beach over here, that's totally fine. If you did introduce an invasive species, then what we want is as much tracking as possible. We want to be able to see how did that happen. So if you purchase oyster seed, like baby oysters from Taylor Shellfish, they're filing paperwork saying we took oysters from this bay and put it on this specific beach. And so every time shellfish are moved in this whole country, there's like monitoring in place of where things moved around, because invasive species are a really big issue. And here we have the green crab has been pretty detrimental. We have a little snail called an oyster drill that is starting to drill through a lot of oysters. And so we just want to be super careful with that. We will be, hopefully with the Oyster Network, creating an island-wide shell recycling program next year in partnership with Puget Sound Restoration Fund, so that it would be a pathway towards using it in their projects. You have to age them outside for like a year and a half and monitor them, and turn it with a forklift or with shovels. So it's a whole thing, but we are looking for property for that, and would like to have, 2 sites, one on the north end and one on the south end. So if you know anyone who has a bit of land that could handle people dropping off shells randomly, maybe a forklift turning things over, and the possibility of rats coming to check out the shells, please get in touch. So not your backyard. So if you're doing this in a commercial operation, and you want a single oyster like this and not that oyster attached to, a whole bunch of other oysters, then you're gonna put the oysters into a swimming pool when they're at this stage, just ready to set. That's what we call that. They set on the shell, and then they become spat. You're gonna put them in with like grain of sand size oyster shells. So that shell is going to be just slightly bigger than the oyster is at that point. So that oyster is going to think, great, I'm attached to a big oyster shell. This tells me that this is a good place for me to live. Other oysters are here. I'm going to be safe. And then the oyster is going to grow up pretty quickly. It's going to, grow past the size of that little shell fragment. But that's how we do it for all of the single oysters that you're going to get, at an oyster bar. So next time you're eating oysters at a bar, you can tell your friend, somewhere on here, there's a tiny little piece of another oyster attached. And then that, actually sometimes it breaks off throughout their lives, but we're not going to tell them that part. And, the oysters are going to grow in all sorts of weird shapes too. So even if you are tumbling them and trying to control it, there's only so much you can control about them. And there's, you can have them grow onto or around things, even like those mesh oyster bags that we have. I've seen some shells that just like get smushed against the side of the bag, and so then they have like a cross hatching built into the shell. You want to be really careful when you're shucking oysters of the shell itself. So it's really common for people to actually cut themselves on the shell even more than on the knife. So if you are shucking an oyster, let's see, we'll use this one. So I have 3 different knives here to show you. So curved tip, pointy, this is my absolute favorite. I try not to be too biased because a lot of people use other knives and that's totally fine. This slightly shorter tip, it's a little bit thicker and it's straight, it's not curved. This is used a lot. There's a nice little thumb spot in there. This knife was created by a world champion oyster shucker with a degree in ergonomic design. So it has handholds, you can grip it like this, and it's basically like turning a car key. This one is really nice for, a large oyster that's really tough to get into because you get a really good grip on it. If you have a hard time getting into oysters or you get sick of just shucking them, you have so many oysters, you can put them in the oven, on the grill, in a toaster oven, that's my favorite, or in a big pot with like just this much water. I don't even worry about suspending them above the water. I'm just like, some of them will get overcooked a little bit on the bottom, but when you heat them up, they will open on their own. And then you can just use like a butter knife or a spoon to scoop the meat out. But if you're shucking them, let's see, I don't have, Andre, could you grab the one with the top on it? There's one that's the top and the bottom. Okay. This is, yeah, yep. So this is the babies of the Olympia oyster when they're inside of their mother's shell, just hiding out in her little body like that. Very cute. Okay, I talked to you about sequential hermaphrodites. When you're getting oysters, at a restaurant or a grocery store, they're required to keep a shellfish harvesting tag on hand at all times. And so there's a lot of different styles to them, but they'll always tell you the farm, their certification number, the harvest location. We would fill in the shipping date and the harvest date and the site ID, the species, the quantity that was purchased. And then if it's resold, it will have the dates there. So you can always ask if you get them, if you're going to Payless. Payless actually brings in really good oysters. I don't know what do you guys have up here as far as oysters? Yeah. Okay, so yeah, any of those, if you see oysters there and you're curious about them, you're like, I think I might take a chance, you can ask them, can you show me your harvest tag? And then you can see, was it harvested? I would say aim for within 4 days from a grocery store. You can also ask at a restaurant. They're also required to have them on hand. And either way, you want to make sure that there's a lot of liquid in the shell. So it should be swimming in the liquid, not dry on the inside. You don't want something that's just a little bit damp and the bits are stuck to the sides of the shell. We really want it to be solidly suspended in the water. So the oyster, there's a flat side that goes on top and a rounded side on the bottom. Even if it's not this tumbled and smooth, there should be a slightly more rounded side. And then there's a pointy part that's called the hinge. And so we orient it so the flat part is facing up and the hinge pointy part is facing towards you. Hold it in your non-dominant side. And I use a kitchen towel folded over about 4 times, so really thick, just around the oyster shell, and squeeze it really tight on the sides. You need to have something in between your hand and the shell. Gardening gloves work really well as well, like rubber gardening gloves, so you get a really good grip on the oyster and on the knife. But even with the gardening gloves, I use a towel in my hand because it helps to wipe off the knife in between the oysters and in between steps here. So you squeeze it really tight, and then we'll do it with this non-curved one. So you have the butt of the knife into the palm of your hand, and you're thinking about using like forward pressure going like this. And it's a lot more pressure than some people think and a lot less pressure than other people think. So you want to really like wrap your hand around it. You can experiment with different grips. I often will put my pointer finger on the knife itself a little bit, but you're using just enough pressure to cut through the little piece that attaches the shell to itself. So the shell is attached just at this hinge, that pointy part, with a little piece that is basically like a thin piece of leather. So if you think about just a piece of leather like this thin and you're trying to shove a knife through it. So, it's a good amount of pressure initially to get through it, but then like you're through it really quickly. So you want to be careful that you don't stab into the oyster. And if you do stab into the oyster, the belly is right here. So in that belly is all that different combinations of microalgae. And when you take the water out of that, it usually looks brown. So people get a little bit freaked out when they stab into the belly and they see all this brown stuff. But that's the flavor, that's the omega-3s. Like, don't worry, that's not their poop. They send their poop out of their shell immediately. And then inside of the shell, there is, you can see on a lot of shells, this little mark. And that's a scar from the muscle that we're actually going to cut. And so that muscle is always in the top right corner. So if I'm holding a flat part up, hinge facing towards me, top right corner. So when you're shucking an oyster, you're always trying to get in through this little leather piece and then cut in the top right corner from the top of the shell, take that off, and then from the bottom of the shell. So that's the only place the oyster attaches itself to the shells. Clams have really similar body parts as well. They have smaller muscles and they usually have two, including the geoduck on either side, but those you can often pull off. But clams you want to fully cook before you eat them because clams are not held to as strict of regulations as the oysters, so they will be safe to eat, but they're expected that you're going to cook them fully. Unlike on the East Coast where there's a big tradition of eating a lot of raw clams. So over there, they're a little bit more careful, just like raw milk versus pasteurized milk here. So you are going to wrap your hand around your knife, squeeze this tight, and then get that lined up. Put the tip of the knife in that little spot there, and then you're pushing forward, and you can move it side to side like this. You don't want to twist it until you actually have the knife in there about this much. That's a real common thing. If you twist too early, you're just going to break off this top part of the shell. So you put that in side to side, and then once you get the knife in a little bit, then you twist it like you're turning a car key. And what you're doing there is you're just giving enough space so that you can then wipe your knife off, because a lot of dirt can hide out right in there, and then scrape along the top of the shell until you've severed the muscle on the top of the shell. And it is really, I do a lot of like little scrapes like this, just from, bottom left corner to bottom right corner. So then I make sure I get all of it. That's the sweetest part of the oyster, that muscle. That's actually, when you get scallops at a restaurant, it's just that muscle that's holding the shell together that you're eating. So super sweet, so you want to make sure you get all of it. And then you can discard that. And then you want to make sure you remember to cut it from the bottom. Same little scrapes there. And then after you've disconnected it from the shell, you want to do a quick check with your knife, just kind of scraping off any little shell fragments or pieces of dirt that might be in there. So if we have, you can do a quick rinse under running water. You never want to store them in fresh water, but you can rinse them in fresh water or scrub them to get any mud off of them. And then it's just really common that you get just, a little bit of shell, especially in the spring when they're really doing a lot of growth. And then you put your knife down, you smell the oyster. If it smells like rotting seaweed at low tide, that is a bad oyster, do not eat it. We want a fresh, light ocean breeze, not fishy, not bad. it should be good. If you have any question at all, do not eat it. If you have a question and maybe a little bit of time, go onto my website, click the chat button, send me a message. It does pop up on my phone, so if I have time, I would love to respond and give you pointers on eat that, don't eat that. But always err on the side of caution, especially if you're giving oysters to somebody else, because you never know what somebody's immune system would be like, and shellfish allergies can develop later in life. So we just want to be, careful at all times. Once you've got the oyster into your mouth, you want to make sure that you chew it. And tell everyone who thinks that they should just slurp it down and choke on it that that is not the way to go, especially if they have texture issues and they don't want a slimy thing at all. Chewing it is a good way to remind yourself that this is food, it's fine, there's flavor, it's not just a slimy thing. And it mixes all of those different flavors together. So all of the, the flavor in the belly and the sweetness in the muscle, everything gets mixed together. So you could eat an oyster like this, but you'd probably be cutting it into pieces. And then you would get all of those different flavor components separated. So you're used to having everything all together in your mouth. I think that is it. When we do the tasting workshops, we do the Olympia oyster, our native species, and that is grown on the ground at the Swinomish Shellfish Farm. And then we do one of their Pacific oysters, which is like this, look a little bit rounded, still some natural growth shape because it is on the ground and hand tumbled. And then we do the suspended grown, fully tumbled oyster from Skagit Shellfish, which is more like this, but we also have larger sizes of both from both of those farms. So these two farms, they're really closely located to each other. They're both getting salt water in through Deception Pass, but there's a lot of fresh water from the Skagit River and a lot of little rivers here as well that are changing the salinity in this area. So it's part of why my business name is Salinity, because that salt level is going to be really impacting the way that you taste things. So salt enhances flavor, and the fact that they're grown in really different methods changes the flavor as well. So contact with the ground is going to add a lot more depth of flavor and minerality. And suspended grown oyster, especially in a low salinity bay, it's going to be like a light ocean flavor, like fresh, juicy spring vegetables. And that's my presentation. I hope I didn't go over time, and I'm here for questions.
Thank you. Are there questions from the audience? Yes, hands go up.
Yes. Two things. Like with the oyster, if you get really cold before you open it, it's a little bit easier to open. You throw it in the freezer for a tad. And oysters that are hot, like in warm water, you're saying like 35 degree per se, keep the oyster. I do believe that once you harvest, you got to get it cold and keep it edible. What's your thought?
Yeah, so 65 degrees is the water temperature that you want to not harvest at. So when the water temperature outside, during the summer, it's rare for Puget Sound to reach 65 degrees, but sometimes in areas that are warmed by the sun, it can reach that temperature. So that's the point at which you don't want to be harvesting them. But if you are purchasing oysters, from a grocery store, then 35 is the degrees that you don't want it to go under for very long. But if you are planning on eating them right away, like you were saying, then that could be a good technique because you're essentially killing them, which makes it a little easier to cut that muscle. So that is a good little workaround. So just shock them. So they do hibernate below 45 degrees. So even though they are technically alive when you're eating them, if you don't freeze them, they are in a hibernation stage below 45, so they're not growing. So that's why springtime, when the water does start to rise, that's when they start to wake up, eat a whole bunch of food, put out all sorts of new layers of their shells around the edges, little thin, sharp layers. Anyway.
We had a friend who grew oysters in Mariner's Cove, and he ended up with a really thick shell and hardly any oyster. What environmental conditions would cause the shell itself to be super thick?
So availability of food, without knowing how long, it may have been that the shell didn't necessarily grow faster, but that the body, depending on how old it was, like as an oyster gets older, eventually it'll stop growing bigger and it'll just put on more and more layers. But that's one of the questions, super specific like that is perfect to bring to the Whidbey Oyster Network. So that's what we do a lot of the time is we bring industry experts in and people say, here on the map is where my farm is. Here's a picture of the growing method I'm using. These are the things that I'm experiencing. And the guest lecturer will say, okay, well, what level on the tide is it at? Because if you're getting a lot more sea stars and you have them, at this tide line, maybe move them to this tide line and you'll have a lot less predators. Or you'll experience more growth if you move them, to this other beach. Maybe your friend will let you grow them there. So there are so many factors that it's nice to have that specific thing. And there are a lot of like beach surveys that oyster farms will do before they decide on a different area. Because Whidbey is tough also with the, on the west, it's actually like the currents are really strong and there's not as much success on the west side of the island as there is on the east side with farms. So we're hoping to gather, more data as well from people and say, what have you tried? What's been working?
4 or 5 years ago, we had a heat dome event, and it happened to occur as the tide was going out, and in Penn Cove, at least, almost all the mussels died. Did that affect the oysters as well?
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, we are still there. A lot of them are still recovering, but then being hit by more and more issues. So that was a really, really rough time. Heat or too cold, or like the flooding that we experienced this winter. So Skagit Shellfish, one of the farms I work with, they had like tens of thousands of deaths of their oysters because of all of the fresh water and all of the contaminated fresh water that came into their bay, and they were shut down for like a month. So that's why water testing is really important. And there's only so much that an oyster farmer can do to control their farm. It's really, where did I put them? What structure did I put them in? Did I check on them? Because you can have your oysters get buried in the mud, and so you periodically want to go and make sure that they're above the mud so they can open their shell and take in water. That's pretty much all you can do. You can, work on the quality of the seed and the genetics of the brood stock, but there's so little that they can do and so much they are dependent on. So that's why, all of these oyster farmers are environmental activists to as much of degree as they have time, because there's so much that needs to be done to protect their livelihood. And, they're at the mercy of the water and the tides and the elements, even more than land farmers. So Taylor Shellfish, they're the largest in our state, and they're able to advocate for the entire industry. It's such a collaborative, all the other ones do as well. We have Pacific Coast Shellfish Growers Association that does really amazing lobbying for the industry and connecting all the different small farms. But it takes a lot of work to advocate for and to track all these different laws and regulations that need to happen. So we are, it's a very collaborative industry. Everyone is working together because they're dependent on that same water quality. Any other questions? Okay,
Okay, well,
thank you so much for being here.